A very good morning, everybody, and welcome to the weekly review live on Teachers Talk Radio, where we review the week in education. Joining me this morning, we have Lucy Newberger, we have Brent Poland, and we have John Gibbs. It's been a wonderful Easter for so many of us, but today is one of those days where we are all frightened with the trepidation of returning back to work and planning all of the stuff and marking all of the stuff that we said we would do over the Easter holidays, but haven't. Or in some of our cases, we didn't touch because we really wanted to value that holiday. Now, in the news this week, the Department for Education has published the first wave of its inaugural Working Lives of Teachers and Leaders survey, and we're going to be delving into the findings from that. We're going to be looking at how old is old enough to have your own mobile phone. 1 in 5 3- and 4-year-olds now have a phone of their own. And then finally, the government has rejected calls to ban smacking, saying that physical punishment of children is already banned according to law. But should England follow the example of Wales, Scotland and Jersey by introducing stricter, more stringent laws? Now, to begin with, I want to start by talking about the Department for Education's workload survey. The Department for Education has published the first wave of its inaugural Working Lives of Teachers and Leaders survey. The core report summarises teachers and leaders' experiences of and views on pupil behaviour, pay and reward, flexible working, well-being, professional development and career plans. The fieldwork was carried out in spring 2022. The key findings are 56% of teachers and leaders thought that their workload was unacceptable and out of control. 43% of leaders and 19% of teachers worked at least a 60-hour week in their most recent full working week. 77% of secondary teachers said they spent more time on admin than teaching. A quarter of teachers and leaders reported they were considering leaving the state school sector in the next 12 months, rising to 28% in secondary schools. 69% said that the teaching profession was not valued by society. 61% said they were dissatisfied with the salary they received for the work that they did. More than half of all staff said that flexible working was incompatible with a teaching career. 86% said they experienced stress in their work, and 62% said their job had an adverse effect on their personal life. And 66% of teachers and leaders said the biggest barrier to accessing CPD was workload or competing priorities. If we can start with Brent on this, it's a big picture of doom and gloom, isn't it? Did any of this surprising you at all?
No, actually, I'm 19 years in the profession, and I don't think I've seen morale generally as low as it is. Anecdotally, every school would say that pattern fits, and some schools worse than others, some staff worse than others. Obviously, it's a mixed bag, but on average, we are working harder than we've ever worked. We're asked to do a lot more. The thing that's missing from that is the duties and responsibilities. When you have the government coming out with things like, if we don't report grooming gangs and things like that, that we're liable for a prison sentence, doesn't exactly help us, because I don't think the job of teacher now is clearly defined. What is my job? What am I meant to do? Solve society's problems, look after children, adopt children, feed children, clothe children, house children. What actually are we meant to be doing? Because that's the problem is that, some of us, the goodwill that we have as a vocation has been taken advantage of far too long. And some of us are just burning out. And that's that survey showing that the people are just burning out. And then unless something was done to address this, top down, from bottom up to top down, then the profession is in serious trouble, because the people who are leaving are the hardcore people who have survived austerity, they survived through COVID, they survived through this cost of living crisis. But I know colleagues of mine who are teachers through and through, and they're nearly they're nearly done. So this really is, for me, this should be the kind of the sort of canary in the coal mine, for those in charge to actually act upon, because if they don't, I think we're in a hiding knot. It's hard to rescue this, come back from this, because we will lose far too many staff. And there's no point talking about paying people more, because it's the conditions, isn't it? Not it's the conditions and what's happening in schools rather than just the pay.
Mm-hmm. It is a longitudinal survey. So what we're going to see is we're going to see responses over a longer period of time, and we'll be using that to compare to the initial responses, which were from April 2022. Lucy, did what Brent said there chime with you?
Definitely. I mean, I'm sort of getting a bit of deja vu as well, because all the things that came up in that survey are all things that we have been talking about for years. I mean, I've done less time than Brent. I'm only in my 7th year, but even in that time, it's always been things like workload. This is not new information, but the fact that it's coming up time and time again, and I hope that this time, coupled in with everything else, like the strikes recently as well, that it's going to be kind of, hey, we are at crisis point now more than ever. We need to be addressing these issues.
And John, finally, your thoughts on the findings of the DFE workload survey?
Absolutely. It's sort of horrifyingly not surprising. A couple of years ago in The Guardian, there was an article that said, 40 or something% of teachers are thinking of leaving within 5 years. But overwork, undervalued by society, and all the things that they said, well, you could have guessed they were there. But the question is, I think Brent said it, nailed it, absolutely, that it's reaching a crisis point. And it's going to get, when it happens, it's going to be a long time coming, and people will then pretend to be surprised by it. It began, I mean, you can look back at the kind of austerity, the years of underfunding for schools. You can look back at all the things of trying to make schools solve the problems of society and loading some other expectation, generally involving some sort of data collection or administration on schools. So it's reaching a point where, it is genuinely a crisis. Two small things jumped out at me in that report. One was that teachers see promotion as needing to leave schools. So there was a sort of unstickiness about schools. People not only were they thinking of leaving the profession, but in order to advance your career, you don't stay with the school you're in. Mm-hmm. Well, when did that become normal? When did loyalty to a particular school or staying with a school become a problem? And I think that was a small thing, but I noticed it in my career very much, that there was almost a cult of the outsider. Get someone else in because the people we've got need new ideas. It's a sort of a problem. And if you want to advance your career, move on. Let's hear it for Mr. Chips. Stick with your school.
I mean, John and Brent and Lucy, you've all talked about this idea of there being a crisis and a crisis point, but couldn't we also argue perhaps that teaching is in a state of perpetual crisis, and that we move from one crisis point to another crisis point, and that actually a lot of these findings are not new? If you look back at 2016 and the data from 2016, for example, leaders and teachers' working hours were actually more than they are at the moment. So are we perhaps overplaying this and saying this is a massive crisis by actually failing to sort of look at the long-term nature of teaching? And is this something teachers have just got to accept? Brent, if I could go to you on that one.
Are you saying that we're serial moaners and that we're never satisfied?
I think some people might argue that.
We are.
I think if you look at some of the media outlets, and I think if you look at some people, I think, some people might argue that there's a lot of, there's a lot of stress in teaching, but that's because of the nature of the job, and that's because of, the conditions that we have. And some people might argue that actually we can improve things. Of course we can improve things, but there will always be that additional pressure of being a teacher.
Yeah, what we sign up for, we signed up to be a teacher. But I go back to my previous point. I signed up to be a teacher. I didn't sign up to be a surrogate parent. I didn't sign up for a therapist. I didn't sign up for a social worker. I didn't sign up for a police officer. I didn't sign up for all these. I didn't sign up to be a business manager. I didn't sign up to be a marketeer of my school. I signed up to be an educator, and that's the problem. Education now is basically a dumping ground for policy. It's become far too political football. And as a result of that, Ofsted is your classic example of that. The goalposts keep shifting. Education should always be in a state of flux. We should always be innovating. We should always be ahead of the game. But everything is these days proactively after the event. It's just the way things have worked out. We're not strategically long-term planning within education. And John's absolutely right about that. I've stayed 19 years in my school and I've been careerly punished for it. But I've put down roots. It's my school, my community. And I think there's a mercenary market force is this kind of thing coming into education that I don't think long-term is sustainable. So to answer your question, there's not a sustainability in education that there used to be. There used to be sustainability. Now everything's just patch up job, and it's not working. It's just not working. So yeah.
Kavita Vindran on LinkedIn agrees with you on that point, Brent. She says, so true. Of course, if you want to contribute to the weekly review, we are live on LinkedIn, we're live on YouTube, we're live on our Twitter feed, and you can tweet us, you can post comments on YouTube, and you can reply to our LinkedIn stream as well. And a very good morning to all of our listeners. Now, this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides, and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Time now to move on to our next story. Now, how old is old enough to have your own mobile phone? New research from Ofcom has found that 1 in 5 3- and 4-year-olds now have a phone of their own. This isn't parents handing over their own phone to a toddler to keep them occupied briefly. And actually, when you consider this, the figure rises to 69% of 3- and 4-year-olds who are regularly using phone handsets to go online. 92% of 3- and 4-year-olds who are using a mobile device are watching video streaming platforms. Almost half are sending voice and video messages. 23% are using social media apps. 18% are playing games online. And 11% have posted their own video streaming content. Dame Rachel D'Souza, the Children's Commissioner, said that children this young should not have mobile phones at all. Lucy, do you agree?
I do. I mean, as a primary teacher, and certainly as an upper primary teacher, this is something that is on my radar every day. And there are age restrictions in place for these social media platforms, granted, not very good ones. They, in my mind, they shouldn't be on them. But the difficulty we have is, of course, you can't tell people how to parent their children. But the problem for me is that the issues that are coming up with children using these platforms, being exposed to certain things, are then coming into school and we're forced to deal with it. And so I don't think it's necessary for children to have these devices. We educate about technology in school. We use technology in school. I don't see the need for these children to be messaging each other. I mean, I'm sort of being grossly simplistic, and certainly the younger ones, all you should be caring about is what you're having for tea, for goodness sake. You should not, there's nothing for you to talk about. And also, your friends are the children that you see every day and your parents. There is no one else you need to be communicating with. So that might be slightly over the top, but that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Now, Ofsted's Chief Inspector Amanda Spielman said she was always surprised when primary age children, that's children up to the age of 11, had phones. Now, Brent, you're the parent of a 4-year-old. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I actually would question those statistics, to be perfectly honest with you, because it doesn't match with anybody I know. But then again, that's the thing. Maybe it doesn't match with anybody I know because maybe the people in my social circle, maybe the parents in my social circle have the cultural capital, the nous, the intelligence. You know where I'm going with this, is that maybe it's down to the parenting. And I hate saying it, sometimes the primary educator is the problem, not the school. And again, go back to my previous thing I was saying about what we're meant to do. Are we educating society now as well as educating the children? Do we need to educate the parents and teach the parents how to teach the children? So we saw that during the pandemic. But certainly common sense would dictate that you wouldn't give your child access. I wouldn't sit upon a pornographic magazine in front of my 4-year-old, would I? You know what I mean? Wouldn't I? Right? But that's effectively what people are doing when they're giving their child free access to the internet. Or I wouldn't sit my 4-year-old down with the anarchist cookbook and say, here you go, turn yourself into MacGyver. I do agree. I'm not normally one to be agreeing with the prudish type of part of society. But I think unregulated, uncontrolled material coming at 4 and 3 and 4-year-olds is only going to create long-term issues, which ironically we will then have to sort out when the kids get older, because we'll see that with radicalization, we'll see that with so many different things.
Yeah, Brent, I don't think many 4-year-olds are reading Kropotkin at the moment. Jennifer Howes, who's editorial director.
You never know.
You never know. Jennifer Howes, the editorial director of a parenting platform, NetMums, does suggest, by Brent, that economic factors are playing a part in this. And she said parents have certainly been affected by the cost of living where they are working harder and trying harder to keep their families afloat. And so, if they need their child to sit and play quietly for a bit while they work, that's why they do it. I want to go to John on this one. So is there this sort of economic argument which would suggest that actually children need to be kept occupied, parents are working longer hours, and as a result, they need, this is a form of distraction, and ultimately it's raising a child through a mobile phone. And is this no different to children watching television in the evening?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a sympathy with parents, and I've got to admit not an ignorance, that I don't really know the answer to this. If you said to me, well, what age should children have mobile phones? I'd say, well, when my children were little, there weren't smartphones, and we made a decision, and parents are going to have to make a difficult decision, and it will depend upon things like practical considerations and whether they think that and useful things like keeping their kids happy. Sticking them in front of a mobile phone was not much different sticking them in front of a Disney. But also the considerations of safety and whether your kid takes a big bus ride or whether, and so on, all sorts of things. It'll be a very personal decision for those parents, and hopefully a responsible one. And the reason I sympathize with them is every generation is going to have to confront, from now on, it's probably been true since the Industrial Revolution, some kind of technological change that the parents and the schools won't fully understand, because it's happening in front of their eyes. We're living in this momentous kind of continual revolutionary change. My parents wouldn't let me read. For some reason, I was banned from reading American comics. My parents said, read the Beano, but not American comics. I don't know why, really, but they just
sounds like Michael Gove was your dad. You could look at
Freddy Krueger movies for me.
I think
Freddy Krueger movies.
Yes, I think they saw something sort of unpleasant and louche about Superman. He wore tights.
Is it the pants over the top of the tights? Was that too far?
I suppose that, but I think we're hitting this point, really, isn't it? That, for decades, children have had to be distracted by whatever means, whether that be comic books, whether that be television, whether that might be through playing outside. And mobile phones are filling that void, I suppose. But the other argument, I suppose, would be that there's going to be a cultural dependency. We don't know the effects of long-term smartphone usage, and so this is potentially a very dangerous experiment. And as John says, we're trying to sort of navigate this significant change in our lives right in front of our noses. So. Is parent blaming really okay in this situation for children having their own smartphone, or perhaps for using it but not owning it? Is there a difference? Do we think?
For me, there is a difference. My children sometimes don't. I'm not a parent myself. They have their own iPads, and sometimes my daughter will grab my smartphone in the morning and she wants to watch Minecraft videos. But what I do is I check the filters on my YouTube and I monitor. She's in the corner. She's got my phone for half an hour. That's different to what this report is saying, is these children have their own smartphones. I double checked that story because I thought, is this giving your child a device for half an hour? We give devices to our children when we're traveling. And again, it's those iPads, etc., not on a mobile phone. But if it is a mobile phone, it's YouTube Kids with filters on it for a short period of time. Not completely here's your own iPhone, at 3 and 4 years old. That to me shocked me, and that's why I don't believe that statistic that there are parents giving that device to their children at 3 and 4 years old. I think that's pretty scandalous, to be honest.
Fascinating. Thank you. The survey data comes from Ofcom, which they survey on this. Really interesting discussion. That I think it's time now to move on to our final story of the day. We hope.
Ooh, we're back.
And we're having wonderful technical issues here at Teachers Talk Radio. I think we should probably stick to the audio streams rather than the visual streams, but never mind. I think that was a sign for me to stop talking. Right, let's carry on. The government has rejected calls to ban physical punishment of children in England, saying they are already protected in law. A change in the law would see England follow the examples of Wales, Scotland, and Jersey, where any form of corporal punishment, including smacking, hitting, slapping, and shaking, is illegal. However, In England and Northern Ireland, it is legal for a carer or parent to discipline their child physically if it is a reasonable punishment. If I could start with John on this one, is there a clear line? How reasonable is reasonable? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, reasonable is the problem, and what's reasonable for one parent, what reasonable for one carer will be unreasonable for another. I think if you ask anyone at any time in history, are there things you remember when you were younger or in the past that they sort of ordinarily did in those days, like teachers smacking students? I remember when I was in primary school, I was a very well-behaved child. I was very well-behaved, but I was thrashed in front of the school for walking in the snow, and things of this kind. And you look back on those years, and this is the 1960s, and you think, well, it's absolutely absurd that ever happened, and it would be an outrage right now. Well, I think as time progresses, it's not surprising that a Conservative government doesn't want to come out against smacking. But as time progresses, we will see smacking of any kind, of the ones you described, Tom, as absolutely unacceptable. And it's time society said that. It's just
the government argues that there's no need to pass another law because the Children Act of 2004 says that it is unlawful to assault a child in a way that causes actual grievous bodily harm, and that covers the actions which you describe. And so the government argues there's no need to pass any more statute because it's already covered within law.
No, let's be clear. Let's get rid of the reasonable. There's no reasonable circumstance for smacking or hitting a kid. Don't do to a kid what you wouldn't do to an adult. Just because they're small doesn't mean you can hit them, slap them, push them, pull them, all the sorts of things that you need to alter your relationship with childhood and children. Because because it's a window, that word reasonable, through which an awful lot of unpleasant and horrifying things, which are all too common in our society, will be allowed through. It won't end it, of course. People will still abuse children and so forth. But let's move forward. It's part of the progress of human beings changing their relationship to children. The days of seen and not heard have gone, fortunately, and the days of spare the rod and spoil the child are gone. But we've still got the last vestiges of the idea that parents should still be, necessary now and again to just slap them to get their attention or whatever. Get rid of it. It's time.
I certainly think, from my perspective, and I'm sure I imagine you'll all agree, that from a teacher's perspective, if a child came in the morning and said they'd been slapped or hit or shaken by their parent, that would automatically, before we do anything else, that would automatically go on safeguarding records, and we'd be talking to the safeguarding lead. So I think it raises a very important point, which is that is the law sufficient? And, John's certainly given his view on this. Is the law sufficient, or does it need to go further? Do we need to follow the examples of Wales, Scotland and Jersey and actually make it very clear that any form of corporal punishment is unreasonable and against the law? Lucy, briefly, your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think we need to be in line with the others. It's wholly unnecessary. I've actually had kids I've taught ask me about this in the past and say, did it happen to you? Thinking how old I am. Did it happen to you, or did it happen to anyone you know? I said, not to me, but to my parents. Yes, it did. And they're absolutely sort of horrified by the idea that teachers could once do that to children. They said, and they actually said to me, what are your feelings on that? I said, anyone who thinks about harming, hitting a child, harming a child in any way should not be a parent or a teacher. And that was a satisfactory answer, and off they went. But that is my feeling on it.
And Brent, if you could keep it very brief, please, no more than 30 seconds, your thoughts on this.
Well, as somebody who was not like John, a naughty boy at school, I got pretty badly caned, which show my age, but equally corporal punishment at home. Interesting, I asked my mother recently, who was, spare the kid rod, not back then, back in the 80s, she had two boys who just didn't want to behave. I said, would you ever think about smacking your grandchildren? And the look of horror on her face was one, no, I wouldn't do that, which I found quite interesting as well. Why were you okay with physical punishing your own children, but not your grandchildren? And her honest answer was, times have changed. The times have changed. And we realized that we can't live in the past. It doesn't work. In fact, in my case, physical punishment made me more defiant and probably left me with some issues in later adult life of not liking authority.
Thank you for that. A bit longer than 30 seconds, but thank you for your contribution. It's time to move on to our shows of the week. Fantastic to have everything tech up and running perfectly. Thank you. It's now time to review our shows of the week on Teachers Talk Radio. Now, it's been a bit of a quieter week because a lot of us been on our Easter holidays, but we've still had some fantastic shows on every day. And so I want to start with John, then Lucy, then Brent, and then I'll finish with mine if it hasn't already been taken. John, your show of the week.
Well, the show I'd like to recommend is Ben Thomas and an interview he did with an author called Scott Evans. And it was 100 Ideas for Primary Reading. Now, I wasn't a primary teacher. I'm a retired teacher now. So unlike the rest of you guys, I'm looking forward to a languid and semi-recumbent Sunday. But this particular show was, there are kind of, on Teachers Talk Radio, there's shows that you listen to teachers and you say, well, we're all in this together kind of show. And then there's the kind of show which says, well, what is teaching? What's it all about? And this sort of show is some handy and useful ideas. And that's what struck me. I thought, well, I'd love to hear that kind of interview about things to do in the classroom. Really useful.
Thank you, John. Lucy, your show of the week.
It was yours, HB, with Andrew Taylor, who has just released a book called You Got This, which is basically a big kind of morale boost for not just for ECTs. I mean, it's aimed at ECTs, but it's also, I think, a sort of a testament to all of us in the profession and how we can just have a much better time and the things we can do and tips and tricks that are still useful, I think, at whatever point you are in the profession. And Andrew's so lovely to listen to. So if you need a bit of a boost to go back into the summer term, thoroughly recommend that one.
Oh, the book is quite literally called You Got This. You can't have much more positivity than that. Brent, your show of the week?
Yeah, well, I'm going to be biased as an environmental kind of guy. I loved Harry's Twilight Show on Wednesday, Harry Waters' Twilight Show. But again, I'm a secondary teacher, but it was interesting seeing the perspective of primary, because I love what primaries do. And I was talking about the environmental and eco schools and how to get environmental education in primary school, because I think that is so important. But brilliant. So, and again, ideas that cascade across all levels of education, not just primary. So it was really interesting to see what they do in primary and how that could be applied to secondary. So that's well worth a listen back to that one.
Thank you, Brent. And yeah, my show of the week was the Friday morning break with Poppy Gibson interviewing John McGee, the kindness coach and a real tour de force of positivity. And I think that's sort of been the theme of our shows all week, all this positive outlook, having had some rather negative stories. It's nice to end on a high. And yeah, Poppy and John talked about the simple, healthy habits that we can build into our days to nurture our well-being. And it was in association with Bloomsbury. And we reflect upon how I actually teach kindness explicitly. And we can teach self-care even from a very young age. And it's not just, well, it's not about mobile phones at all, but it's actually about the healthy habits that we can develop in young children. Thank you, everybody, for another fantastic weekly review. I hope that those of us who are going back into work on Monday have a wonderful week, and we don't have too much stress and too much of a burden. I know, obviously, Brent, it will be GCSE focused now for the next 4 weeks until the GCSE start. Lucy, anything? No SATs for you?
No SATs, but just kind of cracking on, getting into some new topics, getting outside more. I love summer term. I really enjoy it. So, ready for it.
And John, any plans for a week ahead?
Fortunately, no. And that's the way I like it at the moment. I'm nicely retired. And when I remind myself about the joys of retirement, I think on a Sunday, it's purely a Sunday.
Thank you, John. And don't rub it in too much. Now, we've got some shows coming up later. At 5 p.m, we've got Maud. And at 8 p.m, we have a debut show. We're talking about all things drama in schools with Wendy Frost on the Late Show. That's at 8 p.m. and Maud at 5 p.m. with the Twilight Show. But until then, we shall see you next week for the weekly review. Thank you to John, Lucy and Brent, and tune in, talk it out.